What if the Nazis captured Moscow? What if, in December 1941, the Red Army never held the gates of Moscow? What if the snow came 2 weeks late, and the Wehrmacht punched through, raising the swastika over the Kremlin? Would World War II have ended in Berlin or in Washington? The story of Moscow's fall is one that belongs to a world just slightly askew from our own. A world where Frost delayed, Stalin hesitated, and Hitler's armies, by sheer momentum and madness, pierced the heart of Soviet Russia. This is not just a tale of tanks and trenches, but a reshaping of the entire 20th century. In this world, the great pivot of modern history swung in a different direction, and everything changed. To understand this divergence, we must begin in the autumn of 1941, amid the mud, blood, and desperation of Operation Typhoon, the code name for Hitler's final push toward the Soviet capital. In our timeline, this offensive stalled just miles from Moscow's outskirts. The bitter Russian winter, combined with overstretched supply lines and fanatical Soviet resistance, halted the German advance. Reinforcements from Siberia, fresh, battle-hardened, and wrapped in white camouflage, pushed the Wehrmacht back. Moscow was saved. Hitler's myth of invincibility shattered. But in this alternate world, two critical variables shift. First, the weather. Instead of freezing rain and early snowfall in October, the Russian autumn stretches warmer and drier, giving the Germans an extra 3 weeks of movement. Second, Stalin's paranoia. In our reality, he trusted a Korean-born Soviet spy in Tokyo, Richard Sorge, who warned of Japanese intentions to strike south, not north. This allowed Stalin to shift his Siberian divisions west to defend Moscow. But in this alternate timeline, Stalin dismisses Sorge as a double agent. The Siberian divisions never come. And so, the Wehrmacht, tired, frostbitten, but unchallenged by reserves, pushes through. On December 9, 1941, German tanks roll into Moscow. The Kremlin is bombarded from the air. Stalin, refusing evacuation until the last moment, is killed in a final stand, or perhaps executed in a quiet NKVD chamber. Moscow falls. The image is burned into the mind of the world, Nazi banners hanging from Red Square. Hitler, delirious with victory, orders a grand parade, a staged celebration in the heart of Slavic resistance. His generals warn of guerrilla warfare, of logistics stretched past sanity, of snow already beginning to fall. But Hitler is deaf to caution. In his eyes, Operation Barbarossa has succeeded. The Soviet Union, he declares, is finished. But nothing is ever so simple. With Stalin dead, the Soviet government fragments. Some generals flee to the east, establishing a provisional capital in Kuybyshev. But most of the political apparatus is paralyzed. Beria, the cunning chief of the NKVD, makes a bid for power but is assassinated by rival factions. The Red Army, demoralized, splinters. Meanwhile, Nazi propaganda declares the end of Bolshevism. In Paris, London, and Washington, there is disbelief. Roosevelt calls it a tragedy for mankind. Churchill, grim-faced and hoarse with fury, addresses Parliament. This is not the end of war, but the beginning of a darker age. Yet even as Moscow is lost, the Russian people do not submit. By the end of 1941, partisan activity erupts across the occupied zone. Entire villages vanish into forests, becoming nests of resistance. German officers are found strangled in their sleep. Railways explode under the weight of supply trains. The Wehrmacht begins to drown in a sea of white, bitter resistance. And still in the east, something stirs. A general little known outside military circles, Georgy Zhukov, begins consolidating remnants of the army beyond the Ural Mountains. He does not speak of surrender. He speaks of winter, but as the snows begin to fall and the front lines freeze in place, Hitler turns his gaze south, to the oil fields of the Caucasus, to Baku, to the black blood that powers war. And he dreams, madly, of a German empire stretching from Paris to Persia. Yet, as with Napoleon before him, the conquest of Moscow is not the end. It is the beginning of collapse. What will happen when Hitler stretches his forces even farther into the Soviet abyss? What becomes of America's role now that Moscow has fallen? And will a fractured Soviet Union rise again, or stay buried beneath the iron heel of the Reich? When Moscow fell, the world held its breath. But Hitler did not. The maps in the Führer's headquarters no longer bore Soviet insignia. Red territories were scraped clean and replaced with jagged black eagles. But there was a glaring void still pulsing on those maps: the oil fields of the Caucasus, the beating heart of Soviet industry, the fuel of tanks, bombers, and ambition. Hitler's vision of empire was not one of occupation alone, it was of transformation. To hold Eurasia, he needed oil. Without it, his panzers would seize and his Luftwaffe would stall. So, while the snow still fell over smoldering Moscow, Hitler gave the order. Operation Edelweiss would begin months earlier than in our history. The German Army Group South was to slice through the soft underbelly of the Soviet Union, down through the Don, into the Caucasus, and seize Baku. But there was one man standing between Germany and the oil-rich South, General Georgy Zhukov. Having retreated east beyond the Volga, Zhukov was not a man defeated, but a man waiting. While Moscow burned and generals fought over Stalin's ashes, Zhukov quietly assumed command over the fractured Soviet military. He understood that Hitler, by driving east and south, had done what no Soviet leader could: overextend his army across thousands of kilometers of hostile land, with no secure supply chain. From Kuybyshev, the makeshift capital, Zhukov orchestrated a desperate campaign of consolidation. Rail lines were redirected, factory equipment was dismantled and loaded onto trains bound for the Urals. Women, children, and prisoners labored day and night in frozen dirt, building new military installations in cities like Chelyabinsk and Sverdlovsk. This was the birth of what would be called the Iron Shadow, an underground Soviet war machine hidden behind the spine of Eurasia, designed to endure total loss and wait for the Germans to bleed. But Hitler was not patient, and he had no intention of stopping. In early spring 1942, German forces surged toward the Caucasus like a black tide. Rostov fell. Maikop fell. Then came the approaches to Grozny. But as the Wehrmacht advanced, their lines thinned. Supply convoys, already overburdened by the harsh terrain and Soviet sabotage, were ambushed constantly. The mountains were not kind to invaders. Roads turned to mud. Airstrips froze. Horses were slaughtered for food. Gasoline ran out. And the Soviet resistance was no longer scattered. From the highlands, thousands of partisans, Chechens, Ingush, Armenians, and retreating Red Army remnants launched coordinated attacks. German commanders reported entire divisions disappearing into the gorges of Dagestan, never to return. The mountains devoured men and machines alike. But the real turning point came not from rifles, but from radio. By summer 1942, the United States had fully committed to the European theater. Roosevelt, stunned by the fall of Moscow, feared that a Nazi Eurasia would shift the global balance forever. Lend-Lease shipments to the Soviets were no longer just aid, they were salvation. In our timeline, much of this aid funneled through Vladivostok. But in this alternate world, with Moscow gone and the trans-Siberian routes compromised, America shifted its bet. Enter Iran. Operation Countenance, in our timeline, a joint British-Soviet invasion of Iran in 1941, still occurred. But now the stakes were higher. Iran became the lifeline of the Eastern Front. Allied forces poured into Persia, not merely to prevent German influence, but to carve a corridor, Tehran to the Caspian Sea, delivering tanks, boots, and food to the Soviet South. Hitler, aware of this, ordered SS divisions to infiltrate the Caucasus and spark revolt among Turkic and Muslim minorities. He hoped to ignite a pan-Islamic uprising against the Allies. But he underestimated the complexity of ethnic identities. Instead of alliance, he bred chaos. Meanwhile, deep within the forests east of Stalingrad, Soviet engineers completed a monstrous task. Entire tank factories had been rebuilt from scratch. From the smoke and steel of these hidden furnaces emerged a new generation of armor, heavier, more mobile, and forged not for defense, but revenge. By October 1942, the German southern front began to buckle. Rain turned roads to swamps. Soviet air raids returned with terrifying precision. German soldiers, exhausted and underfed, froze to death in the shadow of the very mountains they had sought to conquer. And Hitler, seated in the Führer bunker in Smolensk, now his eastern headquarters, refused to retreat. He saw himself as the new Caesar. He had taken Moscow. He would take Baku. He would not be remembered as the man who turned back from the gates of empire. But winter does not honor ambition. As the snows returned and oil fires lit the Caucasus skies in choking black clouds, the German war machine began to grind to a halt, not with a scream, but with a slow, splintering crack. And somewhere beyond the Urals, Zhukov was preparing to strike. But would the Allies give him the time? For while Germany bled in the mountains, another front, farther west, was about to explode. The fall of Moscow was more than a military loss. It was a psychological detonation that shook the capitals of the free world. In London, it brought back memories of 1940, when Britain stood alone. In Washington, it shattered the illusion that the Soviet Union could absorb the Nazi onslaught indefinitely. And in Berlin, it confirmed Hitler's belief that destiny had chosen him to redraw the map of the world. But the Western Allies were not yet broken. They were cautious. They were watching. Roosevelt had hoped for a war of attrition. Let the Nazis and Soviets bleed each other dry while America armed up, then strike decisively. But now the calculus had changed. The Red Army was no longer holding the line. It was vanishing. Every inch the Wehrmacht advanced east meant another step closer to German domination of Eurasia. And in British war rooms, new maps were being drawn, not with red lines of resistance, but black arrows of Nazi expansion reaching India, Iran, and the Middle East. Churchill, ever the realist beneath his poetic rage, knew what the fall of Moscow truly meant. The balance of power had shifted, perhaps permanently. So he began pressing Roosevelt harder than ever. We must invade Europe now, not later, not next year, now, before the gates to Asia open. But Roosevelt hesitated. In 1942, America was still reeling from Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Campaign consumed men, ships, and attention. American generals argued that any premature assault on Europe would end in catastrophe. Remember Dieppe, they warned, a failed Allied raid on the French coast that had turned beaches red with blood. Now, with the Eastern Front collapsing, German forces would be free to reinforce France, the Low Countries, and Scandinavia. An invasion of Europe would be suicide, so instead, the Western Allies turned their gaze south, to North Africa. Operation Torch, the Allied landing in French Morocco and Algeria, became more than a campaign against Rommel's Africa Corps. It was now a statement. The West was still in the war, still capable of striking. But in this alternate history, Operation Torch took on a deeper urgency. If the Nazis controlled Moscow and were pushing toward Baku, then every mile in North Africa became a future launch point toward Egypt, the Suez, and the oil that powered the empire. Rommel, sensing the shift, launched his boldest offensive yet. With reinforcements from Europe now available, thanks to the collapsing Eastern Front, he surged toward Cairo. The British, caught off guard, suffered catastrophic losses near El Alamein. In this altered world, Rommel doesn't stall. He takes Alexandria. Suddenly, the Nazi presence is not confined to the cold steppes of Russia, but pressing against the soft underbelly of the British Empire. India trembles. Iran becomes the fault line between Allied ambition and Axis reality. American bombers begin staging out of Basra and Baghdad. British intelligence officers flood Kabul, hoping to shore up Afghan neutrality. And from the north, Hitler's advisors begin whispering of a new vision: Moscow to Cairo, a continental empire stretching across 3 time zones, with Berlin at its center. But with Hitler's eyes fixed east and south, something else begins to happen in Europe, something he does not expect: resistance. With fewer German troops garrisoning France, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, Relocated to Russia and Africa, the underground movements in occupied Europe grow bolder. In Paris, assassinations of German officers increase tenfold. In Warsaw, Jewish partisans begin smuggling weapons. In Prague, a bomb detonates beneath a Nazi convoy, killing a high-ranking SS general. The Nazi response is brutal. Villages are razed. Thousands are executed. But every act of terror fans the flames. In London, Churchill sees this and begins pushing for an unconventional war. More spies, more sabotage, more propaganda. The British Special Operations Executive, Churchill's secret army, launches Operation Ember, a Europe-wide campaign to destabilize the Reich from within. Their mission: make occupations so costly, Hitler is forced to pull back. Meanwhile, in Washington, Roosevelt convenes a secret meeting with his top advisors. The Soviet Union, fractured but alive, is showing signs of regrouping. Zhukov has not only survived, but is building strength behind the Urals. But the West cannot wait for the Soviets to rise again. If they fail, the world falls under one flag. America, then, must decide: escalate now or wait for the long game. In this moment, a plan begins to form. Something audacious, something that, in our reality, would be called D-Day. But in this alternate world, it comes not in 1944, but earlier, riskier, bolder, desperate. As winter tightens its grip on Eurasia and Nazi tanks claw their way toward the Caspian, a new whisper echoes through Allied halls: Europe first, or never. And so, as Stalin's ghost fades and Rommel's tanks roll across Africa, the Western world prepares for an invasion that may end the war, or end hope itself. In the wake of Moscow's fall, Europe stood transfixed by German triumph. But far to the east, behind the frostbitten ridges of the Ural Mountains, something ancient and unyielding stirred. A resilience born not from ideology, but from survival. Zhukov understood the terrain of desperation. While the Nazi machine stretched thin across Russia's empty plains and frozen forests, he was rebuilding, not Moscow, not Leningrad, but the very engine of war itself. The Soviet evacuation of industry had begun even before the capital fell, but now it accelerated with terrifying precision. Entire steel mills, tractor plants, and munitions factories were disassembled in days, shipped east in endless convoys, and reassembled in Siberian cities once thought peripheral to power. Magnitogorsk, Chelyabinsk, Sverdlovsk, Novosibirsk. These were not names whispered in European war councils. They were ghost cities in the cold, hidden behind smoke and snow, pulsing with hammer blows and forge fire. In these places, Soviet laborers worked 20-hour shifts, driven by fear, by grief, by hatred. And watching over it all was Zhukov, the Iron General, now more legend than man. He did not make speeches. He did not write manifestos. He organized, calculated, prepared. The Red Army was no longer the army of 1941, sloppy, over-politicized, shattered by purges. What he built behind the Urals was lean, precise, almost mechanical. He called it the second skin of Russia. Meanwhile, the German occupation of Moscow had begun to fester. The city was dead, not just administratively, spiritually. Hitler had envisioned it transformed into a German paradise: broad boulevards, statues of Teutonic knights, Slavic culture burned from memory. But the city resisted, not in open rebellion, but in silence. Sabotage became routine. Occupation troops vanished. Sewer tunnels turned into escape routes and ambush points. NKVD remnants ran shadow networks beneath the Kremlin ruins. And in the forests, entire Soviet battalions that had refused surrender waged guerrilla war. The Wehrmacht, trained for blitzkrieg, now found itself wading through a swamp of invisible enemies, unable to trust civilians, unable to rest. And still, Zhukov waited. By mid-1943, the tide began to shift, not in headlines, but in ratios. For every tank Germany produced, the Soviets now produced 3. For every German rifle shipped from Berlin, 4 came from Soviet plants east of the Volga. But it wasn't just quantity. Zhukov had adapted. The T-34, already a formidable machine, had been upgraded, its armor reinforced, its gun refined. And most critically, its production had been simplified for mass scale. Soviet engineers designed tanks that could be built in under 2 days, repaired in the field, and operated by hastily trained crews. And those crews? They came not from conscription, but from grief. Fathers whose families had burned in German reprisals. Sisters whose brothers had been hanged as partisans. Teenagers who had known nothing but war. Their morale was not based on slogans, but revenge. This was not Stalin's war anymore. It was Zhukov's. It was Russia's. And as he surveyed the new Red Army he had assembled, 1 million strong, fed by miles of supply trains and protected by winter's return, he knew what he had to do next. Strike. Not to recapture Moscow. That would come later. He would not fight for symbolism. He would fight for arteries, rail lines, fuel depots, command hubs. He would bleed the Wehrmacht from its feet upward until it collapsed under its own weight. The first blow came at the Volga. In a city that bore the dictator's name, Stalingrad, a German division attempted to cross and secure the final southern flank. But Zhukov was ready. Hidden artillery units pounded the crossing points. Soviet snipers, many of them women trained in the Siberian forests, turned the ruins into a graveyard of German helmets. The Wehrmacht reeled. Hitler, furious, ordered reinforcements. He could not lose Stalingrad, not after gaining Moscow. But to send help south, he had to pull troops from the west, again weakening France, again enraging his generals. And Zhukov smiled, because he knew the West was watching, knew the Allies were preparing something, a new front, a landing. He didn't need to win everything. He only needed to hold long enough for Hitler to lose everywhere at once. By the end of 1943, the Red Army was no longer a broken force. It was a blade. And in the frost-lit nights beyond the Urals, train whistles echoed. More troops, more tanks, more war. But the question remained, would the Western Allies move fast enough? Would they open the second front before Germany crushed the Caucasus? Or would Zhukov be left, once again, to fight alone? As Soviet planes took to the skies over the Volga, the answer would be decided not in Russia, but on the beaches of France. It was winter in London, 1943, and the air inside the war rooms was heavy with smoke and apprehension. Beneath layers of concrete, in a warren of dimly lit corridors, the fate of the free world was being decided, not by armies, but by arguments. The question was no longer if, but when. For months, Churchill had pressed for an invasion of continental Europe. For months, Roosevelt had hesitated, caught between Pacific demands and political pressures. But now, reports from the East told a different story. The Soviets were not only alive, they were bleeding the Wehrmacht dry. Zhukov had not collapsed. He had adapted, and in doing so, he had bought the West time. But time was not infinite. The Germans still held Moscow, still controlled the Baltic, still ran their black banners across all of Central and Eastern Europe. And in North Africa, Rommel's gains had stalled, but not reversed. Egypt held, barely. At the Casablanca Conference, Churchill, Roosevelt, and their generals met face to face, eyes red from sleepless strategy. Stalin was absent, dead in this world, but his legacy lingered in every map. His death had left a vacuum. Zhukov was now the axis upon which the Eastern resistance turned, but he could not win the war alone, not forever. And so the question, would the Allies land in France? In our timeline, D-Day came in 1944, after long preparation, overwhelming material superiority, and months of deception. But here, there was no time for luxury. A 1943 landing meant risk. The Germans, unburdened by a full Eastern Front collapse, still had divisions ready in Normandy, Brittany, the Netherlands. The Atlantic Wall had been fortified with concrete, machine guns, and mines. Any early landing would be a bloodbath. Yet delay would mean worse. Hitler's grip over Eurasia was tightening. The Caucasus was crumbling under German pressure. Iran, though bolstered by Allied presence, was vulnerable. and reports whispered of German rocket development in Peenemünde, something that, if perfected, could bring London to its knees again. The decision was made in a single, shattering moment. Churchill stood up, his voice cold, not theatrical. "If we wait, we die." Roosevelt, after a long pause, nodded. Operation Hammerfall was born. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. Land in Normandy before summer 1943. Use every available ship, every paratrooper, every deception trick in the Allied arsenal. Let the Soviets know, not in words, but in action, that the West was coming. The buildup began immediately. Thousands of Americans crossed the Atlantic, crammed into Liberty ships. British factories doubled output. Canadian, Australian, Polish, and Free French units were reassigned. Every available resource bent toward one singular objective: breach the continent, fracture the Reich, and make Hitler fight in two directions again. Meanwhile, the Germans sensed something. Intercepts grew suspicious. Luftwaffe reconnaissance picked up strange movements along Britain's southern coast. But the Nazi high command, bloated with arrogance from Moscow, doubted the West had the nerve to strike so soon. They were wrong. On May 29, 1943, before dawn, Allied ships appeared like shadows on the Normandy horizon. Beaches codenamed Sword, Juno, Gold, and Omaha exploded into chaos. Machine guns swept sand. Men fell before even reaching the surf. But they kept coming, wave after wave, driven by rage, fear, and belief. By noon, a bloody wedge had been driven into Hitler's fortress Europe. The cost was staggering. Over 20,000 Allied casualties. In the first 24 hours, towns like Caen and Bayeux reduced to rubble. But it was done. The Second Front, long demanded by the Soviets, long dreaded by the Nazis, was real. And for the first time since Moscow's fall, the Third Reich was fighting a war it could not control. Hitler flew into a rage, screamed at his generals, ordered entire divisions to redeploy from the Eastern Front and from Italy. But every soldier sent west weakened the push into the Caucasus. Every tank diverted to Normandy meant one less on the road to Baku. And that was exactly the point. Zhukov understood this better than anyone. As the Allies clawed inland from Normandy, he unleashed a surprise offensive near the city of Saratov, using fresh Siberian reserves and a secret stockpile of Katyusha rocket batteries. The Germans, caught between collapsing logistics and two simultaneous offensives, faltered. By the end of June 1943, the German advance into southern Russia stalled entirely. Baku held. The Caucasus held. The dream of a Nazi Eurasia cracked. But no one celebrated, for what came next was no longer a question of survival, but revenge. And revenge would come not from Moscow, not from London, but from the skies above Berlin. By the summer of 1943, Europe was burning. The Nazis, once the architects of unstoppable conquest, now found themselves trapped within a continent they could no longer hold. Their empire stretched too wide, their armies pulled too thin, and their enemies, once divided, had become united by necessity and fury. Normandy was bleeding but secure. The Allied foothold had expanded inland by July. Towns were liberated, then destroyed in the process. German panzer divisions struck back with ferocity, but for every tank they lost, they could not replace it. Their factories, once the pride of the Reich, were now targets. Because the war had entered a new phase, a phase not of tactics, but annihilation. For the first time, the Allies held air superiority over continental Europe. Not just in isolated skies, but across a corridor stretching from the English Channel to the edges of the Rhine. American B-17 Flying Fortresses, flanked by P-51 Mustangs, began daily raids into the German heartland. Factories in Hamburg, refineries in Leipzig, ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt. One by one, the arteries of the Nazi war machine were severed. But even that wasn't the breaking point. Berlin became the symbol. In our reality, the bombing of Berlin came late and cautiously. But in this alternate world, where Moscow had fallen, where the Reich stretched to the Urals, the West knew it had to go further, faster. In August 1943, under the command of General Curtis LeMay, the Allies launched Operation Iron Rain. The objective? Reduce Berlin to ruin. Night after night, wave after wave, the city was hit. At first by the RAF, under cover of darkness, then by the USAAF in daylight, unflinching. Fires erupted across neighborhoods once untouched. Palaces, ministries, radio towers, and cultural landmarks all vanished in flame. For the first time, the German population felt total war, not as rumor, but as thunder. Bunkers overflowed. Hospitals collapsed. Morale began to wither, not from fear alone, but from betrayal. Many Germans had believed Hitler's promises of swift victory, of unassailable strength. Now, with Moscow in Nazi hands, but bombs falling on Berlin, questions began to fester. And while Berlin was burning, the East was moving. Zhukov, at last, gave the order. A coordinated offensive across 1,000 kilometers of front. From the Volga to the Don, from Kursk to Astrakhan, the Red Army surged west with a force unseen since the Napoleonic Wars. But this was no glorious cavalry charge. It was a mechanized wave, thundering across steppe and city. Soviet T-34s, hardened in secret factories, punched through German defensive lines. Il-2 Sturmovik aircraft strafed convoys and artillery batteries. Entire German regiments disappeared in encirclements known only by their code names: Black Sun, Frozen Wolf, Crimson Gate. Behind the red lines came the revenge squads, NKVD units tasked with hunting collaborators, reasserting Soviet authority, and reclaiming lost territory. Some brought justice, others brought terror. But all carried the same message. Moscow might have fallen, but Russia had not. As Hitler diverted more forces west to repel the Allied push into Belgium and northern France, his eastern front collapsed with horrifying speed. Kazan fell, then Kursk, then Smolensk. The same city from which Hitler had once plotted his drive toward Moscow was taken by Soviet infantry in a storm of artillery and fire. For Zhukov, the map was a circle. He intended to close it, and he wasn't alone. By October 1943, the Western Allies had reached the outskirts of Paris. General Patton, relentless and insubordinate as ever, drove his tanks into liberated cities before supply lines could catch up. Eisenhower, cautious but resolved, allowed the momentum to continue. De Gaulle returned to French soil, hailed as a hero. Yet even amidst victory, horror lingered. Mass graves, destroyed villages, and a Europe still soaked in grief. But one question loomed over all others. Who would reach Berlin first? It was a race neither side openly declared, but every general understood. Zhukov had the numbers. The Red Army was now 20 divisions strong, pushing into Belarus and Ukraine. Every mile gained was paid in blood, but the Germans were retreating. No longer organized withdrawal, but rout. Meanwhile, in the West, the Allies debated. Should they slow their push to allow coordination with the Soviets, or accelerate to prevent a communist Europe from forming behind the Iron Curtain before it even descended? Churchill, ever wary of Stalin's ghost, urged caution. Roosevelt, terminally ill but still focused, wanted victory before the next election. Behind them, the shadows of a post-war world had already begun to form. But the war was not yet over, and Hitler was not yet dead. In Berlin, the Führer had withdrawn into the Reich Chancellery's deep bunkers. His speeches had grown erratic, his orders disconnected from battlefield realities. But even as generals plotted behind his back, he clung to a single delusion: that a final counterstroke, a miracle weapon or betrayal in the Allied camp, would turn the tide. What he didn't know was that both sides were already preparing the final blow. And deep in the forest of Poland, something monstrous was taking shape, on both sides of the front. Autumn 1943 painted Europe in gray. Not the hopeful gray of rebuilding, but the ashen tones of cities dying slowly. From Rotterdam to Riga, chimneys coughed smoke not from hearths, but from burned-out industry. The Wehrmacht was retreating across every front. But even in retreat, Germany remained lethal, cornered, vengeful, and increasingly desperate. And as Allied generals stared at the final push toward Berlin, something darker began to cloud their intelligence reports. Whispers, intercepts, scientific chatter buried in code. Peenemünde. On an isolated stretch of the Baltic Sea, far from Allied bombers and partisan raids, the Germans had not just been building rockets, they had been building something else, something worse. British intelligence, through the Ultra program, had intercepted cryptic messages referencing Vergeltungswaffe 2, V2, a weapon unlike anything seen before, supersonic, untouchable, and capable of hitting London without warning. But more alarming than its range was its payload. Some believed the Germans had cracked the atom. It seemed impossible. Their brightest minds, Einstein, Fermi, Szilard, had long since fled to the west. The Manhattan Project, cloaked in secrecy under the deserts of New Mexico, was still months away from completion. But in this alternate world, where Moscow had fallen and Hitler's eastern reach had extended farther and deeper, German science had been given everything: uranium from captured Soviet facilities, engineers from looted European laboratories, and above all, time. Time bought by blood. If the Nazis reached nuclear capability first, Berlin could rise again, invincible not by ideology, but by fear. And so, in hidden bunkers and emergency strategy sessions, the Allies made a decision they had never planned to face. The race to Berlin was no longer symbolic. It was existential. It was not just about ending the war. It was about seizing the German laboratories before the bomb was completed, or worse, launched. But the Soviets knew it too. Zhukov, ever the pragmatist, had his own intelligence sources. Defectors, physicists, and partisan networks whispered of German trains hauling lead-shielded crates across Silesia, mobile labs appearing overnight in Polish forests, and strange tremors near Thuringia, earthquakes not caused by nature, but by science. So he too pushed harder. Orders were sent to bypass key strongpoints, leave them behind, let them starve. Every road now led to Berlin. In late November, Soviet forces reached the outskirts of Warsaw, only to find a city already in rebellion. The Warsaw Uprising had begun, not with Allied support, but out of desperation. Thousands of Polish resistance fighters had taken to the streets, believing the Red Army would soon enter. But Zhukov didn't enter. He waited. This was the moment that cracked the alliance in spirit. The West watched in horror as the Soviets lingered just beyond the Vistula River. Some said they were regrouping. Others whispered the truth. Stalin, dead in body, alive in legacy, wanted Warsaw broken before it could challenge Soviet authority after the war. By the time Soviet tanks finally entered the city, much of it had been leveled. And yet, Berlin was still weeks away. In the west, the Allied push crossed the Rhine. Patton, despite orders to hold, launched a flanking maneuver that cut off entire German regiments in the Ruhr. Eisenhower, now supreme commander in name and tension, ordered every available bomber redirected to eastern Germany. Peenemünde was hit, repeatedly, but no one could say for certain if it had been destroyed. Back in Washington, Oppenheimer stood in silence before a classified briefing. The Manhattan Project was not yet ready. The Trinity test was still months away, and across the ocean, the Germans might be closer. Roosevelt, frail and shivering in his chair, asked the question no one dared say aloud. What if they use it first? And then came the message, decoded by British intelligence, intercepted from a Luftwaffe transmission station near Leipzig. A single sentence, Die Sonne wird bald auf London fallen. The sun will soon fall on London. It was either a bluff or a warning. In response, every Allied bomber squadron was given a new target, Central Berlin. Not for military installations, not for supply lines, but for fear. Operation Ashfall, a firestorm campaign designed to cripple German morale, scatter the Nazi leadership, and delay whatever project was underway beneath the city. As night fell on December 6th, Berlin vanished beneath an ocean of flame. More than 1,000 bombers crossed the skies. The city cracked, melted, howled. Civilians died by the tens of thousands, but Hitler survived, buried deeper than ever. Zhukov was less than 100 kilometers away. The Red Army would reach the city within weeks, and the Allies knew, if they were too late, Berlin, and whatever secrets it held, would be under Soviet control. The greatest war in human history was racing toward its climax, and buried beneath the ashes was the power to end civilization. Berlin, December 1943, a city of shadows, cracked stone, and haunted silence. What had once been the proud heart of the Reich was now a maze of rubble and rage. The streets no longer rang with parades, but echoed with footsteps of ghosts, children searching for food, soldiers too wounded to leave, officers too afraid to flee. Above, the skies never cleared. American and British bombers came daily. Fire fell like rain. By night, the city glowed red on the horizon, burning from within, consumed by its own hubris. Entire blocks disappeared, leaving only iron skeletons and the smell of ash. And yet, in the heart of it all, Adolf Hitler still clung to power. Hidden deep beneath the chancellery, in his armored Führer bunker, he ranted over maps that no longer represented reality. Divisions that no longer existed were shifted like game pieces. Orders were barked into radios that returned only static. His most loyal generals, Keitel, Jodl, followed commands with trembling hands. The others had long since resigned themselves to fate. But Berlin was not yet taken, not yet. To the west, the Americans and British had reached the Elbe River. Patton's tanks had crushed German resistance in central Germany, leaving roads clogged with retreating troops and fleeing civilians. Allied aircraft now patrolled the skies as far east as Dresden. The Wehrmacht had lost its punch. What remained was survival. But Eisenhower faced a problem. As reports came in from reconnaissance flights and prisoner interrogations, one fact became unavoidable. The Soviets were moving faster. Zhukov's army, galvanized by vengeance and hardened by Siberian steel, had crossed the Oder River. From the northeast, Marshal Rokossovsky's Polish-Soviet units closed in on the city's flanks. Berlin was now a shrinking circle on the map, choked by pincer movements from both east and west. And no one knew who would strike first. In London, Churchill urged a push. "We must not let the Russians plant their banners over all of Europe," he warned. But Eisenhower, wary of overstretching, made a decision that would define the post-war world. Halt at the Elbe. Let the Soviets take Berlin. It was a gesture of alliance, of coordination, but also of calculation. The Western Allies feared the casualties such a direct urban assault would cost. They had seen what happened in Normandy, in Aachen, in the Ruhr. Berlin would be worse, tenfold, and so the Red Army prepared to claim the final prize. But Berlin was ready, at least what was left of it. Under the SS, Hitler's last fanatics conscripted old men and teenagers into the Volkssturm, the People's Storm. Armed with rusted rifles and Panzerfausts, they were told they were defending civilization. In truth, they were fodder. Alongside them stood the remnants of the Waffen-SS, now more cult than core. In the subways, civilians cowered beside fuel drums and barbed wire. The Nazi propaganda machine, though cracked, still roared, "The Slavs will enslave your daughters. Fight to the last bullet." And so, as January 1944 dawned, the siege of Berlin began. Zhukov struck from the east, pounding the outer defenses with thousands of Katyusha rockets. The earth itself seemed to shake. Then came the artillery, so dense, it was said you could walk across shell craters without touching ground. Street by street, building by building, the Red Army clawed into the city. Snipers hid in bell towers, mines exploded under tanks, bridges collapsed under Soviet armor. But they kept coming, like ice breaking a dam. In the chaos, Hitler's world shrank to a single hallway. He no longer held meetings, only monologues. His once grand staff now whispered of escape or surrender. But no one dared move. The Gestapo still listened. And deep below, behind steel doors, experiments continued. A reactor, a lab, a last gamble. Was it true? Had Germany built the bomb? No one knew for certain, but one Soviet objective was clear: take the chancellery, seize the bunker, capture the scientists, and secure whatever was hidden in the belly of the dying beast. But the cost was savage. In just 2 weeks of street fighting, over 100,000 Soviet troops were killed or wounded. Entire units vanished in ambushes. German civilians, crazed with fear and starvation, attacked soldiers with kitchen knives. Soviet revenge came swiftly, sometimes justly, sometimes monstrously. And as Berlin burned, the West watched. American bombers stopped their runs. Berlin was now too crowded with Red Army positions. British newspapers declared, "The end is near," but offered no celebration. Because the truth had settled across the Western world like a fog. The Soviets had taken Berlin, and soon they would not leave. In Washington, Roosevelt received a sealed report. Zhukov's forces had breached the bunker. Hitler was dead, by suicide, or gunfire, or poison. Details were unclear, but more chilling was what they found. A partially constructed device, hidden in a vault, surrounded by blueprints in German, Russian, and Persian. Uranium had been moved from Iran. Confirmed. The bomb had been real. It was not finished. But it could have been, and now it was in Soviet hands. The war in Europe was ending, but the peace that followed would not be calm. It would be cold, calculating, suspicious. A new front had opened, not of trenches, but of secrets. And Berlin, once the heart of madness, had become the line that split the world. The dust of Berlin's ruins had barely settled when the world awoke to a new reality, one not of victory, but of division. The Soviet flag fluttered over the shattered Reichstag, but the city was no longer a symbol of Nazi domination. It had become the epicenter of a brewing Cold War, a tense stalemate between two ideologies born from the ashes of a war that had shattered nations and reshaped continents. In Washington, Roosevelt's frail frame bore the weight of a world that no longer knew peace. The discovery of the German atomic plans and their incomplete weapons sent ripples of fear through the Allied command. The Soviets now held not only Berlin, but the dark secrets of a weapon powerful enough to reshape civilization itself. Stalin was gone, but his legacy endured through Zhukov and the new Soviet leadership, who wasted no time consolidating power over Eastern Europe. Puppet governments rose like specters from Warsaw to Prague, Budapest to Sofia, each a cog in the expanding Soviet machine. In the West, the mood was grim. The promise of liberation was replaced by the reality of occupation and political spheres of influence. The Iron Curtain, once a metaphor, became a physical and ideological barrier dividing a war-weary continent. But beneath the surface of this fragile peace simmered distrust. The United States accelerated its Manhattan Project, desperate to not only catch up, but surpass Soviet knowledge of nuclear technology. Espionage networks spread like wildfire, as both sides sought to steal scientific secrets and technological advantage. In this fractured world, old alliances strained under new pressures. Britain, battered but proud, sought to maintain its global influence, while France grappled with the scars of occupation and resistance. Germany itself was cleaved in two, east and west, each a pawn in the great chess game of emerging superpowers. The psychological impact of Moscow's fall and the Nazi occupation lingered long after the guns fell silent. For the Soviet Union, the memory of defeat and resilience forged a national identity steeped in vigilance and sacrifice. For the West, the nightmare of a Nazi Eurasia became a cautionary tale that justified unprecedented military spending and global intervention. And yet, even as the world divided, one question haunted every leader, soldier, and citizen: what if the Nazis had completed their bomb? Could humanity have survived a war where the greatest evil had nuclear fire at its disposal? History, as we know it, had been rewritten. But the echoes of that rewritten past resonated into a future defined not by shared victory, but by rivalry and suspicion. As the First Cold War dawned, Berlin remained a scarred city, its streets still bearing the imprint of 2 sieges, 2 armies, and countless lost souls. It was a city caught between worlds, a reminder that sometimes history's greatest battles are fought not just with guns, but with the shadows they cast. And far beyond Europe, new theaters of tension emerged. The Middle East, never fully pacified, became a chessboard of competing interests, oil fields guarded by wary armies, tribal factions exploited by superpowers, and the specter of nuclear proliferation looming ever larger. In the Pacific, the war against Japan dragged on longer than in our timeline. With the Soviet Union's Eastern Front weakened by the collapse of Moscow and its aftermath, Japan took advantage, solidifying its hold over Manchuria and parts of China, prolonging the conflict and complicating Allied strategy. The world was no longer simply at war or at peace. It was in a state of uneasy, volatile balance. And as new weapons were tested, new alliances forged and broken, the question remained: had the capture of Moscow not only changed the course of World War II, but also planted the seeds for a century defined by tension, suspicion, and the constant threat of annihilation? As the guns fell silent across Europe, a new kind of battle began. One fought not on open fields, but in shadowed corridors of power, whispered alliances, and silent nuclear threats. The capture of Moscow by Nazi forces and the resulting shattering of the Soviet Union's command had fundamentally altered the post-war balance. Instead of a Soviet Union emerging as a superpower capable of challenging the West, the East fractured into zones of influence, loosely tied together by Zhukov's legacy and the remnants of Soviet infrastructure now controlled from the Urals and Siberia. Western Europe, battered but free, faced a paradoxical future. The United States, emboldened by its early invasion of Europe and possession of the atomic bomb, emerged as the uncontested global hegemon. Yet this hegemony was fragile, constantly challenged by the lingering specter of Nazi science, co-opted by Soviet factions, and the ever-present threat of resurgent fascism in fractured Germany. Berlin, the city that had borne the weight of 2 sieges, became a symbol not just of division, but of uncertainty. The city was split into 4 sectors: American, British, Soviet, and French. But the lines between these zones were porous and volatile. Espionage flourished, secret police prowled the streets, propaganda battles waged daily on radio waves and newspapers. Without Stalin's iron grip, the Soviet sphere struggled with internal dissent. Nationalist uprisings in Eastern Europe threatened the fragile puppet regimes. Zhukov, now more a warlord than a statesman, ruled with a mix of military discipline and political repression. His vision was clear: to rebuild, regroup, and someday reclaim the heartland lost to the Nazis. Meanwhile, the West faced its own challenges. The atomic monopoly was not to last. Nazi scientists, captured or defected, had seeded knowledge that fueled clandestine programs in both the Soviet-controlled East and Western allies. The world stood on the brink of an arms race that promised destruction beyond imagining. In the shadows of this new world, alliances shifted like sand. Turkey, Iran, and the Middle East became strategic chess pieces. The oil fields once fought over by Rommel and Soviet partisans were now under international surveillance and influence. The fragile peace was punctuated by proxy wars, covert operations, and economic brinkmanship. Culturally, the world changed too. The trauma of a Nazi-occupied Moscow left deep scars in Russian psyche, pride mixed with bitterness, resilience tempered by loss. Western societies wrestled with the reality that their greatest ally had been fractured, that democracy's triumph had been neither simple nor complete. Yet in this fractured world, hope endured. The lessons of total war, the cost of unchecked ambition, the horrors of genocide, the peril of atomic weapons, fostered a cautious cooperation. The United Nations, a fledgling institution in our timeline, rose here as a fragile forum for dialogue, barely holding back the tides of division. And as the 1950s dawned, the question lingered. Would humanity find a way to coexist in the shadow of such destruction? Or was the world condemned to repeat the cycle of conflict, now with weapons capable of ending all life? The capture of Moscow had set the stage not only for the end of a war, but for the uncertain birth of a new world order, one forged in fire, shadow, and uneasy peace. Beneath the cold gray skies of Nazi-occupied Moscow, life persisted, not as it had before, but as something fractured, hidden, and fiercely resistant. The grand boulevards where Lenin once marched were now lined with swastika flags. German soldiers patrolled the streets, their boots echoing off the cracked pavement. The Kremlin, stripped of its Soviet banners, stood silent, a mausoleum to a lost era. Yet, within this city of ghosts, a different battle was being fought. Not one of tanks or artillery, but of spirit. The Moscow underground was a tapestry of whispers and secrets. Resistance fighters, artists, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens refusing to surrender their identity to the Nazi occupiers. In hidden basements and forgotten cellars, samizdat leaflets circulated, carrying news from beyond the front, forbidden poetry, and coded messages. One such group was the Circle of the Last Winter, a cadre of young Russians who met in the basement of a ruined library. They burned candles late into the night, reciting Pushkin beneath the watchful eyes of peeling frescoes. Their leader, a former university professor named Elena, had lost her family to the early days of the occupation, but found in her comrades a new reason to fight, not with guns, but with culture. For the Nazis, Moscow was a trophy, a symbol of triumph, but they had not anticipated the resilience of a people whose history was written in the cold and fire. Secret caches of books and artworks were hidden beneath floorboards and behind false walls. Musicians gathered in abandoned theaters, their melodies a defiant counterpoint to the propaganda blaring from loudspeakers. Children learned Russian history in secret schools, away from the indoctrination centers run by the SS. This underground culture was more than nostalgia. It was a form of rebellion. Every poem written, every song sung, every memory shared was an act of defiance. The occupiers could kill bodies, but they could not extinguish memory. But the stakes were high. The Gestapo hunted these shadows relentlessly. Informants lurked among neighbors. Arrests were common. Elena's group had lost many friends, disappeared in the dead of night, never to be seen again. Yet, in the bitter winter of 1944, a new hope flickered. Word arrived from the east. The Red Army was advancing. Zhukov's forces were pushing westward, liberating one city after another. Moscow's liberation was no longer a distant dream, but an approaching reality. Elena's circle prepared, not just to survive the occupation, but to reclaim their city. They gathered maps, coordinated with Soviet partisans outside the city, and planned acts of sabotage to disrupt German supply lines as the front drew near. In one daring night raid, they blew up a railway bridge feeding German troops in the city, buying precious time for advancing Soviet columns. These small victories were celebrated quietly. No parades, no fanfare, only the steady pulse of hope. But the liberation would come at a terrible cost. The Nazis, sensing the tide turning, intensified reprisals. Entire neighborhoods were razed, families torn apart. The city, already hollowed by war, felt the grip of terror tighten. Yet, amidst the rubble and ruin, the spirit of Moscow endured. When Soviet tanks finally rolled back into Red Square, they were met not just by cheers, but by tears. Tears for the lost, the broken, and the brave who had kept the flame alive. Moscow was free, but the scars of occupation and war ran deep. Rebuilding would take decades. The city's soul had been tested in the crucible of darkness and had refused to die. And as the Soviet flag was raised once more, it was a symbol not just of victory, but of survival. The guns finally fell silent, but the world they left behind was forever altered. The Nazi capture of Moscow was a moment that shattered the course of history, a turning point whose ripples spread far beyond the frozen streets of the fallen city. It fractured the Soviet Union, transformed global power balances, and cast a long shadow over the decades that followed. In this fractured world, the Cold War was no mere political struggle. It was a frozen battlefield haunted by ghosts of betrayal and loss. Berlin, divided and devastated, symbolized not just a city split, but a planet cleaved between two titanic forces, each armed with the terrifying promise of total destruction. Yet beneath the steel and suspicion, humanity endured. Survivors from the scorched steppes of Siberia to the battered ruins of Moscow clung to hope. They carried stories of resistance, survival, and the unyielding flame of identity, even in the darkest times. The United States emerged as a superpower earlier and more unchallenged, yet faced an unrelenting threat. The remnants of Nazi science now twisted into Soviet hands, fueling an arms race of unprecedented danger. Europe became a precarious chessboard, where espionage and proxy conflicts simmered constantly beneath a fragile peace. This world was not one of simple victories, but a landscape of uncertainty and tension, where every dawn could bring confrontation, and every night whispered fears of apocalypse. Had Moscow never fallen in 1941, the war might have ended differently, perhaps with Soviet endurance and triumph. But in this alternate reality, the city's fall tore open the door to a longer, darker conflict, sowing seeds of suspicion that defined the global order for generations. And so, as we reflect on this alternate past, we face a haunting question. Would you want to live in a world where Moscow fell? A world where the Nazis held the heart of Russia but never fully conquered its spirit? Where peace was a fragile, tense standoff between superpowers armed with weapons capable of obliterating humanity? Where every moment balanced precariously between hope and fear? History is made of fragile moments, turning points where a single decision changes everything. The fall of Moscow is one such moment, a doorway into a world both terrifying and mesmerizing. Thank you for joining this journey into what might have been. If this story stirred your curiosity or left you with questions, please share your thoughts below. How do you imagine the world would have changed if the Nazis had captured Moscow? What lessons can we learn from this dark possibility? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join the discussion, because history is not only about what happened, but what might have been.